Hi, my name is Bunjee Garrett, host of Regeneration TV show. During the next hour together, we will tackle one of the biggest problems that our culture faces in this century, the problem concerning truth. Webster wisely stated that there is nothing so powerful as truth, and often nothing so strange. Is truth knowable? Is truth attainable? Is truth absolute? While interrogating Jesus, prior to sentencing him to death, Pontius Pilate asked, "What is truth?" A question that many great thinkers have struggled with and debated over for years and years. Insightfully, Confucius said, "Three things cannot long be hidden: the sun, the moon, and truth." His understanding that truth is as obvious as the sun in the daytime or the moon at night. With conviction, Winston Churchill stated the fact that men stumble over the truth from time to time, but most pick themselves up and hurry off as if nothing happened at all. Unfortunately, this is so often true. Why is it that the subject of truth is so controversial? Truth has been announced as absolute and relative, knowable and unknowable, existing and non-existing. In an attempt to defend the relativity of truth, Protagoras told Socrates, "Truth is relative. It is only a matter of opinion." Socrates responded, "You mean that truth is mere subjective opinion?" Protagoras said, "Exactly. What is true for you is true for you, and what is true for me is true for me. Truth is subjective." Socrates replied, "Do you really mean that? That my opinion is true by virtue of its being my opinion?" "Indeed I do," Protagoras declared. In defense of absolute truth, Socrates turned to Protagoras and said, "My opinion is truth is absolute, not opinion, and that you, Mr. Protagoras, are absolutely in error. Since this is my opinion, then you must grant that it is true according to your philosophy." To which Protagoras conceded by saying, "You are quite correct, Socrates." Along with this same line of thinking, Voltaire wrote, "There are truths which are not for all men, not for all times." This seems to fly in the face of the very nature of truth. The person who believes that truth is nothing more than subjective opinion has stripped the word truth of its meaning, and all you're left with is opinions. The Webster's Dictionary defines truth as the property of being in accord with fact or reality. This simply means that truth is that which corresponds with what really is. Today, starting at the college level and filtering into the general public, this definition of truth is under attack. Much like Protagoras, scores of people have replaced the definition of truth with the definition given to the word opinion. Can this definition actually work?
Truth is relative to each individual person. I think that everyone has a different light to shed on the world in general and on the truth in particular.
If I were to say there are absolutely no absolutes, wouldn't that be an absolute?
No, I still cannot agree with this absolute.
It's always going to be relative to some degree. It's inevitable.
I think there's no absolute truth whatsoever. And what we know is just bias.
What is truth? Good question. There's a few things that one has to say immediately, which is, what do we mean when we say something true? And what does that imply? The old or the usual definition to say some true thing is to make a statement, technically called a proposition, that corresponds to actual reality. The idea that there is truth corresponds to the idea that there is an objective reality that is independent of my thinking.
I think that most philosophers hold to the correspondence view of truth. That is, truth corresponds to that which is real. Truth is that which corresponds to reality. As simply as that. Truth is telling it like it is. Up until the 19th century, almost all major philosophers taught that.
I'm very careful to define truth in classical terms. That a true explanation is one that really does correspond accurately to what is there. There's nothing radical or even distinctively Christian about this approach to truth. It's the way that people thought about it until about 200 years ago in most places.
That's, in a way, the fundamental question, I think. It's a question I've been very interested in as a philosopher for the last 25 years or so. And here I think we do have to go back a bit into the history of philosophy. We have to go back to to Plato, Aristotle, to the tradition that leads from them, the ancient Greeks, right up until, well, the last 200 or 300 years, I guess, when things began to change.
We know what is true is based upon what is undeniable. For example, if somebody says, I don't exist, well, obviously, they have to exist in order to say that they don't exist. So that which is undeniable is true, and that which is unaffirmable is that which is false. Truth is that which corresponds to what is, what reality is.
But the classical view of truth is what I might call a correspondence view. That is, a view that says that there's something going on in the mind of a human being, of a man, of a person, that literally duplicates the world outside of us. So in other words, if I'm thinking that snow is white or that grass is green or something like that, the classical view is there's something in my mind then which is actually white and actually snowy.
That began to change about the 19th century, and that began to come under question. People began to say, are there other ways of acknowledging truth? Or are there other ways of defining truth? And that has led to a lot of confusion, I think, in today's definitions of truth.
It's in contrast to what are popular ideas of truth these days. When it comes to dealing with the kind of questions we talked about earlier, most people feel that whatever I choose to believe and whatever really makes me feel good in believing, this is what truth is. And the idea that these answers really in any sense correspond to what is there doesn't even enter their minds.
Unfortunately, a lot of Christians don't understand that. They have maybe a coherence view of truth. Coherence view of truth basically states that everything is logically consistent within a system. For example, pantheism is a logically coherent view, okay, in terms of the internal parts of pantheism. But does pantheism correspond to reality? I would say no, because in a sense, a pantheist is saying, God exists, but I don't.
One very common view is to say, okay, well, here's what truth is. Truth is just, as Stanley Fish put it, famous English scholar, truth is whatever my colleagues will let me get away with. So truth is, in other words, is something our society constructs. If I utter an opinion, say grass is green, people say, yeah, it's green, you're okay. Okay, that's true now because our society has accepted that. If I say snow is white, yeah. If I say snow is purple, people look at me funny. Maybe they put me away somewhere. Society doesn't accept that, so that's not true. That's an attempt, I think, to solve the problem. Now, there are many problems with that, of course. To me, the most fundamental problem with it is it doesn't really make sense. Because, look, here, remember what the problem is. The problem is we've got these brains with these meaningless nerve impulses going around inside them. And we want to try and figure out how these impulses can mean anything so that they could be true or false of a real world. It doesn't solve that problem to say that, well, society gives them their meanings. Society decides what they're going to mean. Because who's society? Another bunch of people with brains, with nerve impulses running around inside their brains. So if society can't think anything meaningful, right, they can't give meaning to anything, right? Because you could only give meaning to something by thinking something and then assigning the meaning to that thing. And that's just fundamentally incoherent.
The opposite notion is that truth is dependent on my mind. This is what we call subjectivism. It's wholly dependent on the human mind, and that's all there is to it. Of course, that's a self-refuting truth, because if truth is wholly dependent on the human mind, then there's one truth outside of that idea that's presupposed by it, namely that there is at least one human mind upon which truth depends, and the fact that truth is dependent on that mind is independent of the fact that truth depends on this particular human mind. So it presupposes a contradiction at the very outset.
You can't argue that there are no absolutes without creating an absolute, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if there are no absolutes, then there's one absolute. Is that correct?
Yes.
And it makes it a self-defeating argument,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So we can know that there are absolutes.
I mean, I think this is, no, I still don't think there are absolute. Yeah, it's still relative absolute.
I suppose it would be good to think that there is, although I probably would tend to think that there isn't, but that it's just in the nature of man to want to have a reason for being here. They want to have a reason to be living, or want there to be some kind of absolute truth to eventually attain. But I'd have to say there probably isn't an absolute truth.
Do you think that that is a true statement for everyone everywhere?
Yes.
So that's an absolute truth then, right?
Yes.
Of which you
That's
say,
the only absolute truth, I think.
So there's one absolute truth.
Yeah.
So if there's one absolute truth, could there be more?
Nope.
Well, now your argument that there are no absolute truths has already been defeated, right? Because we've found one.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking the same thing. I mean, it depends on what word you want to say. If you call this the absolute truth, then that's perhaps the only truth that you can find.
If you say there's no such thing as truth, you've just made a truth statement, and it cancels itself. It's a self-stultifying, self-refuting statement. But you don't hear that as often as you hear the fact that it's arrogant for you to say that you know what the truth is, or that there is such a thing as truth, not realizing that it's just as arrogant to make that claim. Who's being arrogant here? If I'm being arrogant by saying, yes, we can know truth, well, then you're being arrogant if you say there is no truth. Or who are you to say that there is such a thing as truth? And so the arrogance works both ways. That sword cuts both ways. But it's not arrogant to say that we can know truth.
So, either there is truth or there is no truth. If there is no truth, then one thing is true, namely that there is no truth, which means this is a self-contradictory proposition, therefore false, which means there is true.
It's not as big a question as it sounds like it. When you ask the question, is there such a thing as true, all you're really asking is, are there answers to a handful of basic questions? Is anything there? If so, where did it come from? Who in the heck are we? What happens to us when we die? Is there really a difference between right and wrong other than what we feel? But when you ask the question of, is there truth, you're just saying, are there really answers to those questions? And denying that there is any answer to these questions, like denying that history has occurred. It's impossible. Yeah, truth exists.
While there are competing theories dealing with the question of truth, it would appear that the case for absolute truth is a strong one. So why do so many people opt for the idea of relativism? Many people that I've personally talked with about this subject typically refer to the shift in belief from the geocentric theory to the heliocentric theory. Ptolemy's geocentric theory was the belief that was held by the Catholic Church, which places the Earth at the center of the solar system. The heliocentric theory is a system in which the planets revolve around a fixed sun. Thus, Mercury, Venus, the Earth, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn all revolve around the sun. This theory was first proposed by Nicholas Copernicus. Copernicus was a Polish astronomer who first published the heliocentric system in his book titled On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Bodies, which appeared in 1543. Copernicus died the same year his book was published. Imagine, if you will, the shock of such a theory that suggests everything that we've believed about our solar system for 1,400 years has been wrong. The Catholic Church would not be so quick to concede to this unfounded theory. How does one determine the truth of what is revolving around what, and what is being revolved around? Does the sun revolve around the earth, or does the earth revolve around the sun? In 1609, Galileo improved the design of the telescope, which provided him with a powerful new tool for peering into the heavens. In his attempts to explain the world as it is, he was met with opposition and forced to withdraw his support of the sun-centered theory and live the rest of his life under house arrest where he continued his work. Now people at large point to this paradigm shift to prove that truth is relative. Does truth change? Was it true that the earth was the center of the universe until 1543? Or is it our beliefs and opinions that have changed concerning what is true?
Everyone's experience is different, so everyone's truth and their view of what's going on is different.
I don't think that necessarily anyone is wrong.
I have to make reference to my own experience, obviously. How else can I answer this question?
Yeah, again, I think truth can be different for different people.
I mean, this depends what kind of stuff you want to know. I mean, something I think you can know some absolute truth, but something I think it's related to your own standing, where you stand.
I don't know, it's kind of one of those things that at 19 you don't necessarily have to have figured out. But I think that there is what is, but that's not necessarily any more important than what people believe, because people act based on what they believe.
People adapt in their own mind.
Belief is definitely somebody's truth.
The problem, I think, is because we live in a post-Kantian world. Let me explain what I mean by post-Kantian. Kant basically said that you can know the phenomenal realm, the realm of appearance, like I can know that this is a cup, but I can't know that it's a cup in and of itself. I only know it's a cup to me. And since Immanuel Kant, basically, we have kind of lost a kind of a belief in truth, in absolute truth, or that you can know truth. Because we can only know the realm of appearance. We can't know what reality is in and of itself.
And I think what happens in the last 300 years or so of Western history is that thinkers, philosophers have tried to imagine that the human mind is not something special in the way that the classical picture had it. That is, that maybe all that's going on is, all we really have is just a brain, a bunch of matter, with all these electrical impulses or whatever surging through them. If that's your picture of what human beings are like, then the classical correspondence theory of truth doesn't work.
Yes, we live in an era now in which people have given up on the idea that it is possible to know. Generally, they feel that there are one or two possible options, both of which are false. Either I know something absolutely and perfectly, which only God does, or I don't know anything at all. That's false dichotomy. It is possible to have reason enough.
What I'd like to help people to understand is that even Kant's statement that you can't know reality, you can't know the noumenal realm, is that a noumenal statement or a phenomenal statement? And so one of the things I would try to point, if I'm talking to someone who's a little more educated, help them to see that basically Kant was wrong, that there is such a thing as truth. In fact, Kant couldn't even deny it, because in the very process of denying that there is truth, you have to affirm a truth.
Either there are some things that are true, really true, objectively true, independent of what I think about them, or there is not. Take the case where there is not. If it is true that there is no truth, then there is one thing, only one, but one thing that is in fact true independent of what anybody thinks about it, namely that there is no truth. That's a proposition that has independent status of what the person says.
Or if the skeptic says, you know, look, you can't believe anything unless everybody agrees with you, then again I can turn the tables on the skeptic and say, why believe that? And moreover, I can point out that, look, not everybody agrees with the skeptic. Not everybody agrees that you can't believe everything unless everybody agrees with you, right? So I don't agree with the skeptic, right? I disagree with his principle. Therefore, if he's consistent with his own principle, he's got to give up his own principle, right? So now he's out of business.
So when you say we can't know anything for sure, do you think that you know that we can't know anything for sure?
Yes.
So you know that you can't know anything for sure.
Yeah.
But you know for sure
Yeah.
that you can't know anything for sure.
Yeah.
How can that be?
Galileo, is the guy who came up with the geocentric theory of the universe, of the solar system, rather. He didn't actually come up with it. He borrowed it from Nicholas Copernicus. And it becomes accepted in Galileo's time And you would think that the response to this is, well, we got that one figured out at last, we can move on now. But in his day, it really just rattled people big time.
There are two things that come up quite often in this discussion. One is people once thought that the earth was flat. The flat earthers believed and sincerely believed that the earth was flat. But believing it all day long didn't make it so. We found out that it wasn't true. And the sincerity is not a gauge for truth. A lot of people will argue, yes, but it was true for them. However, it wasn't objectively true. We have discovered that the earth, in fact, is not flat.
So now, scientists used to teach that the world is flat and that the sun revolves around the earth. Later on, we discovered that the earth is round and that it's the earth that's revolving around the sun. Does that mean that because they sincerely held the belief that the world was flat and that the sun revolves around the earth, does that mean that that was true at that point in time?
No, it wasn't true, but it was... It's what people needed to believe at the time in order to progress and to get on to finding what was actually going on.
The idea or the belief that the earth is flat and that the sun revolves around the earth, being that that was true for scientists at a certain point in time, didn't make that true. So
Correct.
it was a belief,
Right.
and it was true to those people, but there was an ultimate truth, there was an ultimate standard that proves that what their belief was wrong.
Right.
What we do is we tend to confuse ontological and epistemological response to that. Ontologically, the earth is not flat, even though epistemologically people believed that it was. And so we discovered finally epistemologically that ontologically the earth was round. And so you'll see a lot of confusion today in ontology and epistemology.
The idea was that if we can be wrong about anything that is this basic, we can be wrong about anything at all. And the result was, philosophically, contemporary of Galileo is René Descartes. Descartes focuses new attention on this question of how can I really know? And he set himself, in his Meditations on First Philosophy, two options, the same two options that I just tried to shoot down in flames. I will not believe anything of which I cannot be absolutely certain.
The question asked is, why set the bar so high? Why insist that our beliefs have to be infallible before we can claim to know and before we can have confidence in them? I mean, suppose they were 99.999% reliable. It's pretty good. I could live with that, even if it turned out they're not 100% reliable. So likewise, I mean, in the case of the Earth, does the Earth move or not? Well, we felt pretty sure it didn't move. Turned out we were wrong. I mean, going back to that period of time, there were pretty good reasons to think that the world didn't move. It sure looks like it doesn't, right? It doesn't feel like it's moving. It took a lot of evidence, took a lot of arguments to convince us that the world really was moving. And rightly so, because it was a natural sort of belief that we formed. We had good reason to stick to it until overwhelming evidence to the contrary is presented. And that should be our pattern in general, right? In other words, I recognize I'm fallible, of course. That doesn't mean I'm just going to give up all my beliefs helter-skelter. You've got to pick one of my beliefs and then present some sort of evidence of why it's wrong. There's a burden of proof here on the skeptic, is the point.
Somebody says that there is such a thing as truth, but we can't know it. My question to them would be, how do you know we can't know it? It's kind of like Immanuel Kant saying we can only know the noumenal realm up to that point, I mean the phenomenal realm, but not the noumenal realm. We can't know what reality is in and of itself. We can only know what appearance is. How do you know that we can't know anything more but unless we know more than?
I'm not ready to concede that notions about the basics of truth vary as widely as some are, but even if they did, that wouldn't mean that the facts themselves had changed. That would only mean that our opinions had changed.
Well, there's a difference between saying our perception, our understanding of what is true can increase in accuracy, and saying that no truth exists at all. When I was a child, I didn't know how to read. I didn't know that 2 + 2 equaled 4. I didn't know the difference between north, south, east, and west. And I went to school and I learned those things. And I realized that some ideas that I may have held as a child earlier were wrong. But realizing that didn't in any way make me think, gosh, simply because I have changed my mind and learned something new, I have to give up the idea that anybody really knows anything. It's an absurd notion.
So even the statement that, yes, I believe there is absolute truth, but we can't know it, that is unaffirmable. And I would just challenge people now, what led you to that conclusion? What led you to know that there is such a thing as truth, and yet you believe that we can't know it?
Truth is truth, whether you know it or not.
If truth is, as Webster defined it, the property of being in accord with fact or reality, or that which corresponds with what really is, we must discover what really is, or what is real, in order to discover absolute truth. The problem with this is that, as humans, we are fallible. Once we thought the earth was flat, now we know it is round. The earth is really round. Therefore, the earth is round for all people, in every culture, at all times. We once believed that the sun revolved around the earth, and now we know that the earth revolves around the sun. Therefore, the earth revolves around the sun for all people in every culture at all times. These truths are absolutely true. The problem lies with our fallible brains attempting to grasp absolute truth. Is this possible? Galileo said, all truths are easy to understand once they are discovered. The point is to discover them. Can we discover absolute truth? Or is there only our perception of the absolute, and so we're left once again with our opinions? German philosopher Immanuel Kant said, all our knowledge begins with the senses, proceeds then to understanding, and ends with reason. There is nothing higher than reason. Is this the case? All we have is our own reasoning? How bleak and dismal is this? This leaves us back with Protagoras' belief that what is true for you is true for you, and what is true for me is true for me. Truth is merely subjective opinion. This belief system is why Kant said, may you live your life as if the maxim of your actions were to become universal law. With this as the standard of truth, what's the difference between Mother Teresa and Adolf Hitler? Can we know truth? Is there a way to come to any conclusions about absolute truth? Or will we be forever trapped in a world where knowing truth is forever beyond the reach of our minds?
I think it's noble if you're willing to know it. If you're not open to the fact of it, then I don't think that you'll be able to understand it at all. But if you're willing to accept that there is, then you will know it.
Well, I believe that, you know, when you're born into the world, you're naturally born with kind of an adaptation. You know, you touch the stove and it's hot, you probably won't touch it again. You know, you kind of learn.
I mean, I think that's what the whole goal of this higher learning is to pursue truth, whether it be in nature or in moral things, or but otherwise, if there's not a goal of truth, then I don't know why people are studying in the first place.
We're all moving towards the universal truth, and when you get enough perspectives together, you'll find it eventually, if you can get people to agree.
We're probably not ready to totally get it yet. We're not at that state, it would seem, as a collective body of humanity.
The question is, how do you know that you can't know them, first and foremost? And that there is good evidence not only that we can know them, but in a lot of ways we really do.
Not only can we know it, not only do we have the ability, is it within us to discover, but we do know truth.
Philosophers say a couple of things about absolute truth. They will admit that you can know some things, but that you can't know all things. Well, that's true. We know enough to know that we can't know it all or that we don't know it all. But that means through philosophical insight and so forth, we can progress in the pursuit of truth. And since truth tends to be beyond us and something that's discovered rather than determined, then it is a worthy task to discover this truth, discover what truth is. And I think philosophical insight and introspection can lead us to that. So you've opened the door to that once you've said, yes, there are some absolutes.
The mistake, I think, that a lot of people have made, both philosophers and ordinary people, is thinking that you've got to first work out your theory of knowledge, which in philosophy we call epistemology. You've got to first figure out what knowledge is, when to recognize when you have it, what it consists in. And you have to do that before you're allowed to do any theology or science or anything else. So epistemology, the theory of knowledge, is the super science you do first. And then once you've got that worked out, then you can do all the other sciences, because now you know what knowledge is and you can just apply your epistemology to the data and come up with the right answer. And I just think that's fundamentally wrong, right? There's no reason to think that as I'm trying to figure out what knowledge is and how it works, that I somehow have to throw everything else I know about the world out the window and pretend I know absolutely nothing. I don't think that makes, that just doesn't make any sense. Why should I? If I believe that I'm created by God and I'm trying to figure out what knowledge is, why shouldn't I apply my beliefs about God to my theory of knowledge? And secondly, if you really do try, as some philosophers did, to throw absolutely everything out of your brain, out of your mind, just start off with an absolutely empty slate, right? And now just try to figure out what the nature of knowledge is from ground zero with nothing. You'll know you get nowhere, right? From nothing, nothing comes. If you've absolutely emptied your mind, you've got an empty mind, and that's it. You're not going to come up with any interesting theories about knowledge.
You go back to that same basic handful of questions we started with. Does anything really exist? There really aren't that many possible answers to it. You can say, as we've said in the West, yes, and then go on and try to explain it. You can do as they've done in the East and say no, and then try to explain it away. Same thing is true for every one of the rest of the questions. If there's something there, where did it come from? Who in the heck are we? What happens to us when we die? The bottom line is there just aren't that many possible answers to any one of those questions. I think it's quite possible, in light of my knowledge of myself, the world that I live in, to come to answers that are not only things that I can hold to with some integrity in the midst of it, but really are inescapable. They really are inescapable.
If you were to ask me, how do we know what is true? I would say that we know what is true is based upon what is undeniable. For example, if somebody says I don't exist, well, obviously they have to exist in order to say that they know that which is unaffirmable, that which is false.
In our situation, there's a philosopher named Neurath in the 1920s who gave this illustration that it's something like you're in a raft in the middle of the ocean, right? And the skeptic says, how do you know that boat's been ideally constructed? There might be a better construction. Why don't we take the raft apart completely? And then we'll start all over again and we'll build a much better boat. Well, that's pretty crazy, right? I mean, you're in the middle of the ocean. You've got a raft. It's not a bad raft, right? You don't just tear it apart and start all over from scratch. And that's what the skeptic wants us to do. Instead, what you do is you keep the raft intact. And if the skeptic says, I think that board should be moved over there, then you can debate that. And you can say, well, let's see. What's that board doing? Is it really useless over there? If the skeptic can convince me, yeah, that's a useless board where it is. It's much better if we moved it over there, made it into a rudder. Okay, maybe we can improve the boat. That's the way this sort of philosophical process and scientific process should work. Right? The skeptic shouldn't just come along and say, empty your mind, cast out all your beliefs, and start from scratch. Instead, he should say, here's why I don't think this particular belief is right. And that's not skepticism anymore. That's just good reasoning. That's philosophy. Or that's using your head, so to speak. That I'm all in favor of.
Instead of sort of trying to justify, I'm going to take human nature and I'm going to prove to you bit by bit by bit by bit that we aren't just animals. These guys kind of take it from a different approach, and it's, look at yourself. You're not an animal. I'm not going to try to prove that to you. What makes sense of the fact that you aren't? Well, the only thing that really makes sense for the fact that you are is that you were in the beginning made in the image of God with those capabilities.
Well, here I think we have to step back and say, well, what is a human being, right? And a human being is created in God's image. And what does that involve? Well, God himself, right, is a spirit, is someone who knows things, in fact knows everything. And I think part of being in God's image is that we too know some things. We don't know everything. We're not God ourselves. But we do have a natural aptitude for truth that God has given to us.
So not only is there a truth, but eventually it will come to the surface. They will have to admit, yes, I know what those terrorists did in 9/11, that was wrong. Even if they say to me, it doesn't really matter what you believe as long as you're sincere. That does not correspond to reality. That does not correspond to how they really feel.
So we've come to a place where we can know that there are absolutes, and that those absolutes are knowable. Most relativists will agree with many absolutes that pertain to physical laws. They will agree that certain temperatures will cause water to boil or freeze, no matter the source of water or temperature. That the arbitrary measurements we give are standard anywhere we go. That gravity will affect all matter everywhere to various degrees. These truths tend to be widely accepted, where moral truths, and especially metaphysical truths, tend to be clumped into the realm of the relative. The argument that there are no moral absolutes is typical in the world today. You might hear it at the pop level like this: what's good for you is good for you, and what's good for me is good for me. There is to be no standard of what is good for all mankind. However, this flies in the face of how people really think. Ask anyone and they will agree that there is a way we ought to live. We ought to be kind. We ought not abuse children. We ought to tell the truth. We ought not kill or steal. These things are agreed upon by all cultures. Why? Because there is a moral law, which is universally absolute. So why are moral absolutes so controversial, you wonder? Here's why. If there were a moral law, there would have to be a moral lawgiver. If there is a moral lawgiver, we are answerable to that being for the times that we break moral laws. Mankind does not want to be accountable to his actions. Therefore, as Paul put it, we suppress the truth in our unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhood, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. Paul is not resorting to name-calling here. He is simply stating that there are things that should be more than obvious to the average person. Why is there order in the universe instead of chaos? Because there are physical laws which govern the universe. Why do all cultures agree that murder and stealing are wrong? Because there is clearly a moral law written upon our hearts. The question that must be answered is, where do the physical laws and universal laws of morality come from? It should be more than obvious that the universal laws derive from a lawgiver who is outside of our universe. This is why Paul says that we know God, and yet we're working very hard to suppress that knowledge about him. To reject the true lawgiver for a God of your own design is to worship the creature rather than the creator. A popular concept in the world today is that all religious writings reveal the same God. The belief that we're all trying to explain the same God, yet all religions say different and even contradictory things about God, brings us back to the argument that we cannot know absolute truth pertaining to metaphysics. Or it is to suggest that God is not able to communicate with man effectively or efficiently. The argument that all religions worship the same God is ludicrous at best. One religion claims that there is only one God, while another claims a plurality of gods. One religion claims that God can beget a son, while others say he cannot. One religion says that all religions are ways to God, while another religion claims to be the only way to God. Is God a God of contradiction? So then how do we conclude absolute truth when it comes to truth claims about God?
personally, I don't believe in God. Like, I mean, I do like have a God, but I don't like, I don't practice religion. But for people who do, I guess like it's more relative than anything else because it just depends from like race to race and religion to religion.
Think about religion, belief in God, belief in precisely what kind of God your God is like. That's definitely a truth for that person, whatever it is that they believe about their God.
I would say that God is probably not the same for everybody. It kind of depends on a lot of things, your background, what kind of things people taught you when you were a kid, and what kind of experiences you've had. If you, for example, if you put a lot of faith in God and maybe you feel like he didn't deliver to what you think he should have delivered to, maybe you'll start losing a little bit of the faith. So I would say, yeah, depending on a person's background, culture, what people have taught him, tried to feed into him when he was a kid, plus their own experiences with life is going to determine what they think of God.
I don't think that necessarily the different religions are in conflict with each other, except for that the actual people are in conflict with each other. I don't think that that one has to be wrong for both to really be worshiping God, because if there is a single creator, then they're doing basically the same thing.
I talk to students, they don't believe in truth. They think everything is relative. Well, what they really mean is that everything is relative as it applies to religious truth. Now, when it comes to their own personal truth, did their girlfriend cheat on them, those kinds of things, well, there is a truth on it. There is a truth, they believe. It's just when it comes to religious truth, they don't believe there is such thing as truth. And so my question to them is, why is it that in the area of religious beliefs, there is no such thing as truth, but there's truth in other areas? Can you help me understand that?
Are we just complicated animals, the result of the evolutionary process? If so, then I need to see myself and understand myself in those terms. Are we really creations from the beginning, not the results of chance, made in the image of God, and we have responsibilities that go along with this? And I need to see myself and understand myself in those kinds of terms either. I think people often will embrace ideas like evolution, for example, without really considering what the implications of those ideas are for how I should see myself when I look in the mirror. And it's getting them to bridge that gap that makes the question of really coming up with an answer that you can live with and believe a lot easier, I think.
People say we need to make moral progress. Well, to what are we progressing? There's got to be a standard then. If we're making moral progress, if we're striving for moral progress, we have anthropologically a standard in mind. People say we want to make the world better. Well, better implies a best. To what is it that we're moving? What are we moving toward? Another thing that I think really argues for moral absolutes is a sense of incumbency, is what philosophers call it. It's incumbent upon us to behave in certain ways. It's incumbent upon us to honor, to have duty, to treat others as we would have others treat us.
We can say that we don't believe in truth. We don't believe that there are moral absolutes. But if there's one thing that we all agree on as being right or wrong, that's a moral absolute. A moral absolute is something that applies to all people, and at all cultures, and at all times. If there's one thing that we can agree on that is wrong, such as maybe torturing babies, then wouldn't that not imply a moral law?
Let's take the case of the wrongness of murder. Across all cultures, there is such a thing as murder. And while beliefs about the precise boundary delineating what constitutes murder may change, it doesn't change at its core. There's something called innocent human life, and murder is always the taking of it, and murder is always wrong.
Is morality absolute, or is morality relative from culture to culture also?
No, morality is absolute. Like there are certain things that you just cannot do, like kill someone, hurt someone, and like stuff like that, and like break the law.
And does not a moral law imply a moral lawgiver? So if that's true, then relativism essentially hasn't answered that objection. And we should use that kind of argument with people to help people to see that there may be some things that they haven't really thought through very carefully.
Tobey Maguire, who played Spider-Man, pretty good flick by the way, on the cover of Parade magazine, he said, "I had to find my own truth." And that is part of, I think, where young people are today. They think that truth is whatever you make it. There are no objective truths. That calls into question the Christian worldview. That calls into question the claims of Christ, who claimed to be truth, who made truth claims, who says that truth is something that can be known and that truth will set you free.
I've discovered that with students especially, the issue is not, is there such a thing as truth and can I know it, but do I want to obey the truth? And I find the Bible says in Ephesians that they are ignorant because of their hardness of heart. They are ignorant, not because they can't know. They choose not to know. And they suppress it in unrighteousness.
My belief about whether or not God exists says a lot about me. My belief about whether or not God is good says a lot about me. It says nothing about the fact of whether or not he exists. But when you find a whole bunch of people across cultures, civilizations that have come up at different times across history, sharing some basic beliefs, even if they don't go all the way to full-blown, say, Christian doctrine or something like that, you begin to suspect that there is something that they all know way deep down, and that is that there are some basic truths about reality. And that, in fact, these truths are absolute, and that these truths involve God's goodness, God's character, and we're accountable to him.
Sometimes I talk to students and they'll say that, they don't really care about religious truth and those kinds of things. And I share with them a personal story, a tragedy that happened in our family. Basically, my sister Rhoda was a few years younger than me. We grew up in a Christian family, and when she became an adult, she basically kind of threw out her Christian beliefs. And she had difficulty finding meaning and purpose in her life, and she struggled for many, many years. And she got more depressed and discouraged, and she just had nothing to hold on to. And about a year ago, last Christmas, my sister committed suicide. And I think of all those people out there on college campuses who are like my sister, who maybe haven't committed suicide, but inwardly they're dying. You see, the truth really does matter. It really does matter what we believe, because what we believe has consequences both now and for all eternity.
It changed C.S. Lewis's life when he realized as an atheist that there was a moral law, that he was arguing in a circle, that he had no right to call anything evil and condemn the Nazis if he didn't have a standard by which to judge. That led him to theism and eventually to Christianity.
So I had to come to the conclusion that there are absolutes, and we must be able to know them, or we can know what they are. So I began to do research to discover what is absolute truth. Why am I here? What is the purpose? What is the meaning of life? And upon looking into various religions, upon looking at the philosophies and the truth claims of the different prophets, of the different alleged deities and whatnot, I came to the conclusion that the Bible is what holds the absolute truth, that the standard of right and wrong and the knowledge of God is simply found there in the text of the Bible.
Right? How do we know the gospel is true? How do I know that Jesus is God and that the resurrection really happened? Well, there's facts, of course. You have to know all those facts about the manuscripts and so on. But also at some point you have to say, well, what are the different theories about what's going on here, well, here's the Christian story. It just has a ring of truth to it, I think, in light of those facts. It just makes sense of the facts in the way that no other theory does. And so this is why it grips us intellectually and should grip us intellectually, and why therefore we know it.
And the thing we need to understand about that is truth is not only a propositional, but it's personal. Jesus was the embodiment of truth. He came down and died on the cross and paid the penalty for you and I so that we can have that relationship. And so Jesus is the embodiment of truth.
I'm convinced that the answers that are given in Scripture really do fit the way things are and the way they happened. If you want to think of history as the fingers on your hand and Scripture as a glove, not to get into the O.J. trial here, but the glove fits. It fits. There's a correspondence between what the Bible says about these things and the way they really are. And that's what truth means.
If the God of the Bible is not the true and living God, then what are we left with? There is no standard for truth. Therefore, morality, logic, science, and philosophy are all futile, like a man trying to grasp the wind. What are we left with besides a life of subjective ideas with no fixed point of reference to determine if we are right or wrong? People who altered the course of history like Adolf Hitler, Osama bin Laden, Mother Teresa, Martin Luther King, and even Jesus are just people that did and said things that you might or might not like, but that is it. School shootings and softball are both equally valid ways for youth to blow off steam. Building a company from the ground up and a hostile takeover are equally valid ways of doing business. The obstetrician and the abortionist are both doctors with equally valid careers. Yet something inside of us cries out and says, no, that's not right. It's better to create life than to destroy it. There is a way we ought to live, act, and think. It's our job as Christians to challenge those who see truth as opinion. Paul commands us to pull down strongholds. Pulling down strongholds means to destroy arguments and reasonings by which a disputant endeavors to fortify his opinion and defend it against his opponent. Paul commands us to cast down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. Casting down arguments means to refute reasonings which are hostile to the Christian faith. We are to destroy and refute the reasonings which are opposed to the knowledge of the God found in the Bible. It is our job to point people towards the true and living God so that they can make sense of this life. When a professor tries to teach you relativism, ask him if he will be grading your exams during the semester. He'll most likely say yes. Ask him then, by whose standard will you be grading the exams, mine or yours? The relativistic professor has no basis, no standard for grades, since every answer to every question should fall into the realm of the relative. Next time a student tries to sell you on the idea of relativism, ask him why in the world he's paying so much for a college education when truth is just a matter of opinion. Next time someone tries to convince you to believe that truth is relative, it is your job to convince them of their need for the truth that is Jesus. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Absolute truth and the meaning of life is found in Jesus Christ, our Maker and Creator, and that's the absolute truth.